Rome occupied Britain for nearly 400 years, longer than the entire history of the United States. They built London, they built Bath, they built York, they paved 10,000 miles of roads across the island. At its peak, their garrison numbered 55,000 soldiers, stationed in forts from Hadrian's Wall to the cliffs of Dover. Including families and dependents, an estimated 125,000 people connected to the empire lived on British soil, in a province they controlled for almost 4 centuries. And yet, when geneticists finally decoded the DNA of modern British people, they found something that should be impossible. Almost no Roman genetic signature anywhere. Not in London, not in York, not in the towns Rome built from nothing. Yet the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever seen ruled this island for 400 years and left virtually no trace in the blood of its people. How? How does that happen? The British have claimed Roman heritage for centuries. It's in their architecture, their legal traditions, their idea of what civilization means. But what if that heritage was never in their veins? What if it was always a story they told about themselves, and the DNA tells a completely different one? Because here's the thing. The answer isn't just about Rome. It's about a chain of genetic replacements, some violent, some silent, some still unexplained, that stretch back thousands of years before Caesar ever crossed the English Channel. And the truth about who the British really are is something no history class ever taught you. If you're fascinated by lost histories and ancient DNA mysteries, subscribe for more untold stories. But to understand why Roman DNA vanished, we need to go back, way back, to the people who were already in Britain before Rome even existed. And their origin story starts with the builders of Stonehenge, who were not who you think they were. What if the people who built the most iconic monument in human history were completely wiped from the gene pool before that monument was even finished? Around 6,000 years ago, roughly 4,000 BC, a wave of Neolithic farmers began arriving in Britain. They didn't come from the island. They migrated from Anatolia, what is now modern Turkey, part of a slow agricultural revolution that had been sweeping across Europe for millennia. These were the people who would transform Britain. They cleared forests, they planted crops, they built permanent settlements, and over the next 1,500 years, they constructed something the world had never seen: vast stone monuments, long barrow tombs, and the first phases of Stonehenge itself. But here's what no one knew until ancient DNA technology made it visible. These Neolithic farmers didn't share the island peacefully with the people who came before them. The original inhabitants of Britain, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who had lived there since after the last ice age, were almost entirely genetically replaced. Not through a single dramatic war, but through slow demographic pressure, more food, more children, more villages. Generation after generation, the farmers expanded and the hunters faded until they were practically gone. And those original hunter-gatherers? In 2018, scientists at the Natural History Museum in London extracted DNA from Britain's oldest complete human skeleton, a man called Cheddar Man, who died roughly 10,000 years ago in a cave in Somerset. The results stunned the world. Cheddar Man had blue eyes and dark to black skin. Dr. Tom Booth, a researcher at the museum, said, "They had dark skin and most of them had pale-colored eyes, either blue or green, and dark brown hair. The first Britons looked nothing like the people who live there today." So the Neolithic farmers replaced the hunter-gatherers. They remade Britain, they built Stonehenge, and for over 1,000 years they were the people of this island. But they wouldn't last either, because around 2,500 BC, something came from the east that would erase nearly everything they were. A new people arrived carrying bronze, horses, and a bloodline from the distant Eurasian steppes. Within just a few centuries, 90% of Britain's genetic code would be rewritten. And what happened to Stonehenge's builders is one of the most shocking discoveries in the history of genetics. Imagine discovering that 90% of your country's entire population had been genetically replaced. Not over thousands of years, over centuries. That's not fiction. That's Britain. And we only found out in 2018. They're called the Beaker People, named for their distinctive bell-shaped pottery. They began arriving in Britain around 2,500 BC, migrating from Central Europe. But their roots went much further east, to the Pontic-Caspian steppes of what is now Ukraine and southern Russia. And they were descendants of nomadic herders called the Yamnaya, who had already transformed the genetic landscape of continental Europe. In February 2018, a landmark study was published in the journal Nature, the largest ancient DNA study ever conducted at that time. Led by an international team of 144 researchers, the study analyzed DNA from 400 prehistoric skeletons across Europe. And what they found in Britain was devastating. Professor Ian Barnes of the Natural History Museum, one of the study's co-senior authors, said, "We found that the skeletal remains of individuals from Britain who lived shortly after this time have a very different DNA profile to those who came before. At least 90% of the ancestry of Britons was replaced by a group from the continent. 90%. On the Neolithic farmers who built Stonehenge, who aligned those stones with the solstice, who buried their dead with ritual care, were almost completely gone, genetically erased." And the researchers discovered something that made the timeline even more haunting. Carles Lalueza Fox, another co-senior author, noted, "Beaker culture arrived in Britain just after the last big stones at Stonehenge went up. The people who finished using the monument were almost entirely different from the people who started building it. The Beaker arrivals also transformed what the British looked like. The Neolithic farmers had olive-brown skin, dark hair, and brown eyes. The Beaker migrants brought genes for lighter skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair. Those features, the ones we associate with the British today, didn't come from the Romans or the Saxons. They came from these Bronze Age steppe migrants 4,500 years ago, and this is the foundation. This Beaker ancestry became the deep genetic bedrock of the British Isles. It was already ancient and deeply rooted by the time Rome arrived 3,000 years later. Which is the first clue to understanding why Roman DNA never took hold. But to see the full picture, we need to look at the numbers Rome actually brought, and what those soldiers really were. Rome didn't fail because it was weak. It failed because it never tried to do what you think it did. In 43 AD, Emperor Claudius launched the invasion. The initial force was massive. 4 Roman legions, roughly 20,000 soldiers, plus auxiliaries, servants, and camp followers, totaling between 35 and 40,000 men. They crossed the Channel in nearly 1,000 ships. Within decades, Roman towns were rising across Britain, Londinium, Aquae Sulis, Eboracum. But here's what the history books leave out. Rome never colonized Britain the way modern empires later colonized continents. There was no mass settlement of Italian families, no waves of Roman civilians pouring onto British soil. The garrison, which peaked at around 55,000 troops in the mid-2nd century, was the empire's tool of control. And against a native British population of 3 to 4 million people, that garrison represented roughly 3% of the island's inhabitants. A thin military crust over a vast native population. And even those soldiers were not genetically Roman in any meaningful sense. By the mid-2nd century, and over 70% of the garrison was made up of auxiliary units, non-citizens recruited from across the empire. The troops stationed in Britain came from Gaul, from Belgium, from Spain, from Romania, from Syria, from North Africa. A Roman soldier buried in York might carry Middle Eastern DNA. The famous Vindolanda tablets, letters found at a fort near Hadrian's Wall, reveal soldiers from the Tungri tribe in the Ardennes region, writing home in local languages, not classical Latin. And the DNA proves this directly. In 2016, researcher Rui Martiniano and his team published a study in Nature Communications examining Roman-era skeletons from York. Of 7 genomes analyzed, 6 showed genetic affinity with modern Welsh and Celtic populations, meaning they were native Britons, not Mediterranean immigrants. And only 1 skeleton showed clear origins from outside Europe, with ancestry pointing to the Middle East. As the researchers noted, this confirmed the cosmopolitan character of the empire even at its northernmost fringe. Then in September 2024, a study by Sheeb and colleagues, published in Molecular Biology and Evolution, examined 33 late Iron Age and Roman-era genomes from rural Cambridgeshire. The title of their paper said it all. Low genetic impact of the Roman occupation of Britain in rural communities. In the countryside, where the overwhelming majority of Britain's population lived, Roman DNA was essentially invisible. Rome gave Britain its roads, its cities, its laws, its language of power. But it never gave Britain its blood. Roman Britain was a cultural performance, a veneer, and underneath that veneer, the genetic bedrock laid by the Beaker People 4,000 years earlier remained untouched. Then, in 410 AD, Rome did something no one in Britain expected. It left. And what rushed in to fill that vacuum would achieve something Rome never could. When Rome abandoned Britain, it didn't just leave behind crumbling walls, it left behind a power vacuum so complete that an entire civilization would collapse into it. In 410 AD, Emperor Honorius reportedly told the cities of Britain to look to their own defenses. The legions withdrew, the imperial administration dissolved, and within a single generation, 4 centuries of Roman infrastructure began to fall apart. Roofs collapsed, coins stopped circulating, aqueducts cracked and ran dry, towns that had bustled with trade went silent, and Britain plunged into one of the most poorly documented centuries in all of European history. Almost no written records survive. The lights, quite literally, went out. And from across the North Sea, new peoples began arriving. Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Frisians. From the coastal lowlands of what is now northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. For over a century, historians argued about what happened next. Was this an invasion? Hordes of Germanic warriors slaughtering the native Britons? Or was it a small elite migration, a few thousand armed men imposing their culture on millions? In September 2022, the answer arrived. Published in the journal Nature, one of the largest early medieval genetic study ever conducted, led by Joshua Gretzinger and Stefan Schiffels at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, analyzed 460 ancient genomes from across northwestern Europe. 278 were from England. The results were staggering. In early medieval eastern and southern England, approximately 76% of genetic ancestry came from continental northern Europe, from what is today northern Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark. 76%. This wasn't cultural diffusion. This wasn't a few warlords at the top. This was a mass migration that fundamentally rewrote the population of eastern England. Gretzinger stated, "Some Anglo-Saxon sites look almost 100% continental European. The only explanation is a large amount of people coming in from the North Sea zone." And critically, this wasn't a military invasion. Dr. Maria Pala, a specialist at the University of Huddersfield who analyzed the mitochondrial DNA, demonstrated that the immigrants were made up as much by women as by men. In other words, whole families were involved. Entire communities were relocating. Archaeologist Duncan Sayer put it simply, "I suspect there are families, or even small villages, getting up and moving." The Celtic Britons, the people whose DNA had survived 400 years of Roman occupation completely intact, were now being displaced, absorbed, and pushed to the margins. The Anglo-Saxons achieved in 2 or 3 centuries what Rome could not achieve in 4. They didn't just change the culture, they changed the blood, but they didn't change everyone. In the mountains, in the rain, in the wild western fringes of the island, the old blood held. And it's still there today. There's a reason the Welsh call themselves Cymri. It means fellow countrymen, because for 1,500 years they've been the last of the original Britons. While eastern England was being genetically remade by Anglo-Saxon families, the western and northern edges of Britain told a completely different story. The 2022 Nature study confirmed it plainly. Most present-day Scottish, Welsh, and Irish genomes showed ancestry from the Bronze Age and Iron Age populations of the British Isles with little or no later continental contribution. In Wales, in Cornwall, in the Scottish Highlands. The ancient British DNA, the deep Beaker and Bronze Age lineage, survived. Indeed, not because these people fought harder than the Britons in the east, but because the land itself protected them. Mountains, moors, rough terrain, river valleys that slowed expansion to a crawl. Geography became a genetic fortress. And here's the bitter irony that still echoes today. The word Wales comes from the Anglo-Saxon word weal. It means foreigner or stranger. The original inhabitants of Britain were called foreigners in their own land by the newcomers who had replaced them in the East. The People of the British Isles study, published in Nature in 2015 by a team led by Sir Walter Bodmer and Peter Donnelly at the University of Oxford, proved this with extraordinary precision. When the researchers analysed over 2,000 DNA samples from rural Britain, the Welsh emerged as the most genetically distinct population on the mainland. Professor Donnelly stated that the Welsh carry DNA which could be the most ancient in the UK. Their genetic profile connects them not to Saxon England, not to Norman France, not to Roman Italy, but to the people who lived on the island thousands of years before any of them arrived. And the People of the British Isles study found something else. A substantial ancient migration from northern France into Britain, one that happened before Roman times, had spread across England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. But it completely missed Wales. Wales was already genetically isolated before Rome even existed. So Roman DNA didn't vanish because Rome failed. It vanished because it was never deeply planted. And the ancient British DNA that was deeply rooted, it survived Rome. And it survived the Saxons. But only in the places where the land offered protection. The old bloodline held in the West. But the Anglo-Saxons weren't the last wave to crash against these shores. In 865 AD, dragon-proud ships appeared on the horizon. The Vikings had arrived. And they brought their own DNA to the fight. The Vikings conquered half of England, ruled it for over a century, and left their names stamped across hundreds of towns. Any place ending in by or thorpe is a Viking name. So why can't geneticists find their DNA? In 865 AD, the Great Heathen Army, a massive coalition of Norse and Danish warriors, landed in East Anglia. Within years, they had torn through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and carved out a vast territory known as the Danelaw, stretching across northern and eastern England. York became Jorvik, a thriving Viking capital. Norse settlers poured into the Scottish Islands, the Irish coast, and deep into the English heartland. For 2 centuries, Scandinavian power reshaped the political map of Britain. But when the People of the British Isles team analysed the DNA of modern English people, they found something no one expected. Professor Peter Donnelly, the study's lead author, said, "We see no clear genetic evidence of the Danish Viking occupation and control of a large part of England. Despite over a century of political dominance in the Danelaw, the Danish Vikings left no distinct genetic cluster in the modern population." Donnelly explained the logic. If the Vikings had left behind significant traces of DNA, we would expect to see them in the Danelaw areas and not in all areas of the UK. We see no remnant of the Danelaw. In 2020, the largest Viking DNA study ever conducted, published in Nature by a team from Cambridge and Copenhagen, sequenced the genomes of 442 Viking-era individuals from across Europe. Their conclusion for Britain, up to 6% of the UK population carries Viking DNA. Dr. Daniel Lawson from the University of Bristol, a co-first author, said, "The genetic legacy in the UK has left the population with up to 6% Viking DNA. Real, but modest compared to the Anglo-Saxon transformation. Except in one place, Orkney, the islands off the northern tip of Scotland. The People of the British Isles study found that the population of Orkney carries approximately 25% Norwegian Viking ancestry, making them the most genetically distinct group in the entire United Kingdom. But even there, 75% of the DNA was indigenous, meaning the Norse Vikings intermarried heavily with the existing Pictish population rather than replacing them. And then came a discovery that mirrored the Roman story perfectly. The 2020 Cambridge study revealed that male skeletons buried in Orkney with full Viking warrior gear, swords, shields, the whole burial ritual, were not genetically Scandinavian at all. They were genetically similar to present-day Irish and Scottish people. Dr. Lawson noted, Scottish and Irish people have integrated into Viking society well enough for individuals with no Scandinavian ancestry to receive a full Viking burial. Being a Viking, just like being a Roman, was a cultural identity you performed, not a bloodline you inherited. The pattern repeats. Cultural tides wash over Britain, but the genetic bedrock only shifts when massive numbers of people physically move in. Rome didn't bring the numbers. The Vikings brought some, but not enough. Only the Anglo-Saxons brought both the culture and the demographics to rewrite the code. And then came 1066. The event every British person knows, the Norman Conquest, William the Conqueror, the Battle of Hastings, the birth of medieval England. But genetically, the Normans might be the biggest bluff in all of British history. The Norman Conquest changed everything about England: the language, the law, the class system, the architecture, everything, except the one thing that actually matters. In 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the English Channel and defeated King Harold at the Battle of Hastings. The Normans, themselves descendants of Vikings who had settled in northern France and adopted French language and culture, seized total control. They replaced the entire English aristocracy. They imposed Norman French as the language of power. They built stone castles from coast to coast. They created the Domesday Book, a comprehensive survey of every piece of land in the kingdom. English law, English society, English identity was reshaped from the top down. But the supplementary analysis of the People of the British Isles study stated it directly. The Norman invasion in 1066 involved a small ruling elite with limited influx of DNA. William brought perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 followers into a country of 1.5 to 2 million people. Some historians estimate that Norman settlers eventually made up no more than 5% of the total population. It was an elite takeover, not a demographic one. And the 2022 Nature study by Gretzinger and Schiffels added a fascinating nuance. They found that modern English people carry 20 to 40% ancestry genetically similar to Iron Age populations of France. But senior author Stefan Schiffels was careful to note, it remains unclear whether this additional ancestry related to Iron Age France is connected to a few punctuated migration events, such as the Norman Conquest, or whether it was the result of centuries-long mobility across the English Channel. In other words, even the French-like DNA in modern English people probably isn't just Norman. It may have been accumulating through cross-channel movement over many centuries. The irony is staggering. The event that most transformed English culture, that gave it feudalism, half its vocabulary, its stone cathedrals, and the class system that would define it for 1,000 years, was genetically negligible. Meanwhile, the Anglo-Saxon migration, which most people outside of academia barely think about, remains the single largest genetic transformation in Britain since the Bronze Age. The Normans conquered England without conquering its bloodline. But there's one final layer to this story, the most intimate evidence of all. Not from battlefields, not from kings, but from the women. Because when scientists traced the maternal DNA of Britain, the entire narrative shifted. Every empire that conquered Britain brought its men, its soldiers, its administrators. But the women who were already there, they outlasted them all. Mitochondrial DNA, passed only from mother to child, generation after generation, for thousands of years, tells a fundamentally different story than the rest of the genome. While the broader genetic picture shows dramatic turnovers with each wave of migration, the maternal line reveals something quieter, or something more resilient. The 2022 Nature study confirmed that Anglo-Saxon migration involved whole families, both men and women crossing the North Sea together. But it also showed that intermarriage with native Britons was extensive and varied dramatically from community to community. At some sites, migrants and locals lived side by side from the very beginning. At Appledown in Sussex, Dr. Ciridwen Edwards of the University of Huddersfield found that the cemetery had almost 50% continental ancestry, but unusually, there were distinct burial styles for people with local and immigrant ancestry, suggesting some social separation, at least at that site. But at Oakington in Cambridgeshire, people of native, immigrant, and mixed ancestry were buried together with identical grave goods, No distinction at all. And here's what makes the maternal story so powerful. That same 2022 study revealed that while early medieval English populations were roughly 76% continental in ancestry, modern English people are only about 40% Anglo-Saxon. The proportion dropped over the centuries. The native British contribution, the Beaker and Bronze Age Foundation, recovered. Slowly, through intermarriage, through demographic rebound, the old blood reasserted itself. Every conquest was also a marriage. Every replacement was also emerging. Anglo-Saxon men who settled in Britain married local British women. Their children spoke their father's language, bore their father's cultural identity, but also carried their mother's ancient lineage forward. The Viking settlers did the same. Even during the Roman period, soldiers stationed at the frontier married local women. When Rome left, those families didn't leave. They stayed, they blended, and within a generation they were British again. This is the hidden architecture of British genetic history. The conquests you read about in textbooks, the dramatic battles, the burning towns, the new kings, they're the surface. Underneath, a quieter process was always running. The mothers endured, the mothers blended. The mothers carried the old world into the new one, cell by cell, generation by generation. And that process left marks so precise that when scientists finally had the tools to see them, what they found on the map took everyone's breath away. What if the borders of kingdoms that vanished 1500 years ago are still visible inside the DNA of people alive today? Me the People of the British Isles project, led by Sir Walter Bodmer at the University of Oxford, spent over a decade collecting blood samples from more than 4,000 volunteers across rural Britain. Each volunteer had to have all 4 grandparents born within 80 kilometers of each other. That requirement was the key. Because each person's DNA is a mixture of their 4 grandparents, the researchers were effectively sampling the genetic landscape of Britain as it existed in the late 1800s, before the mass movements of the 20th century. Using cutting-edge statistical methods called fine structure, the team sorted 2,039 samples into genetic clusters purely by DNA similarity, with no information about where anyone lived. Then they plotted the results onto a map. The correspondence was extraordinary. Sir Walter Bodmer himself said, "We were absolutely astonished to obtain 17 clusters of individuals based solely on similarities in their DNA that matched remarkably well their geographical locations." 17 genetic clusters. And when historians looked at those clusters, they saw something haunting. The genetic boundaries of modern British people aligned with the political boundaries of Anglo-Saxon England. The ancient kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, Kent, borders drawn by warlords in the 6th century, were still visible in the DNA of people living in those same regions today. Devon and Cornwall split into separate genetic clusters, with the boundary falling almost exactly along the modern county line. So North Wales and South Wales divided genetically along the borders of the ancient kingdoms of Gwynedd and Dyfed. The split in Northern Ireland mapped onto the territories of Dalriada and the Picts, a separation that existed around 600 AD. Professor Mark Robinson, an archaeologist on the project at the Oxford University Museum of Natural History, said, "The results give an answer to the question we had never previously thought we would be able to ask about the degree of British survival after the collapse of Roman Britain and the coming of the Saxons. People haven't moved as much as anyone assumed. The wars, the treaties, the rivers and forests that once divided tribal territories, they left marks not on maps that anyone could read, but in DNA passed silently through 100 generations. We carry the borders of dead kingdoms in our cells. And one more thing. The People of the British Isles study found no distinct Roman genetic cluster anywhere in Britain. Not one. 400 years of occupation. 0 identifiable genetic community surviving in any region of the island. While Anglo-Saxon genetic signatures, from a migration lasting perhaps 200 years, remain sharp enough to map onto a kingdom-by-kingdom grid 15 centuries later. The map is drawn. The science is clear. But this story isn't over. Because the mystery hasn't been solved. It's barely begun. The Romans left no blood in Britain. That much is settled. But what the DNA has revealed goes far deeper than one empire's missing footprint. Britain's genetic story is a template for how identity works everywhere, where it tells us that the histories nations build about themselves, the heroes they claim, the ancestors they celebrate, are almost never the same as the biological reality running through their veins. The British thought they were Roman. They weren't. They claimed a single Celtic heritage. But the people of the British Isles study proved there is no single Celtic genetic group. The Welsh, the Cornish, the Scots, and the Irish are among the most genetically different populations from each other in the entire United Kingdom. What the British are, in overwhelming genetic proportion, are the descendants of two groups most people have never heard of. Bronze Age Beaker, migrants from the Eurasian steppe, who arrived 4,500 years ago and replaced 90% of the island's population, and an Anglo-Saxon farming families from northern Germany and Denmark who arrived 1,500 years ago and reshaped the east of England just as dramatically. Everything in between, Rome, the Vikings, the Normans, left their culture, their language, their architecture, their laws, but not their blood, not in any quantity that moved the needle. And the story is still being written. The 2022 Nature study identified that 20 to 40% of modern English ancestry comes from a population genetically similar to Iron Age France, but the researchers could not determine when this ancestry arrived or through which migration events. Senior author Stefan Schiffels said directly, "Future work, specifically targeting the medieval period and later, will reveal the nature of this additional genetic signal." 20 to 40% of an entire nation's ancestry, still unexplained, still waiting for the graves to be opened, the bones to be tested, and the genomes to be read. Somewhere in Britain right now, there is a person whose mitochondrial DNA traces an unbroken maternal line back more than 10,000 years, to one of the first humans who walked onto the island after the glaciers retreated. That lineage survived the Neolithic farmers, survived the Beaker wipeout, survived the Romans, the Saxons, the Vikings, the Normans, the Black Death, 2 world wars. She carries it in every cell of her body. And she has no idea. The ancestors we have forgotten are waiting to be found. And the next chapter of this story may be the most shocking one yet.